cord of the computer. So it looks like, I can never tell. There it goes. We are back, and it is July. We're on the other side of the divide now. We're on the back half, the back nine, the falling action. And it is July 5th, and we are going to continue going over fallacies today. We're going to finally broach that horrible subject of logos. Finally, after all this time, we're going to talk about finding the actual logical claims of the argument. Although judging by the very few analysis of emotion that I've already read, some of you are already looking for logical claims. Notes incoming on that as well. Not a lot of notes. I've only looked at a couple of the rhetorical analysis, but obviously it's a mixed bag. Like there's a lot of good, and there I think opportunities for improvement. I've gotten through all of the proposals finally. I finished up the last couple this morning finally. So if you turned in a proposal with a few notable exceptions, and you know who you are because we've been in contact via email, if you turned in a research proposal, that has been scored, and there are some comments on that. Take a look at the feedback. Where possible, I included links to helpful resources. I didn't see the rhetorical analysis in the grading criteria. Could you be more specific? What do you mean by you didn't see it in the grading criteria? All that message is formulating. So like I said, there in the feedback, there's some links to some resources, some of them are MLA resources, some of them are grammar concepts, some of them are using quotes concepts, although I don't think that anybody used a whole lot of quotes. I did at least put one of those resources in somebody's rhetorical analysis feedback. I don't anticipate leaving like such extensive comments on the annotated bibliographies coming up, mostly because that's just like kind of sources and seeing where you're at in your research, how you're going to use those sources. I'm probably more than anything going to be leaving comments about the relevance of sources, or mostly MLA type stuff. Which the MLA stuff is just kind of like the more you use it, the more you get acquainted with it. Deborah sent me an email today about an MLA concept that I realized there wasn't a lot of guidance on that particular concept. They haven't really talked about it in a couple editions of the MLA handbook, and now they have like a short paragraph about it on one page. And it turns out I was wrong and the Purdue owl was wrong, but it is what it is. So definitely pay attention to the grading criteria on the rubric, what I'm asking for there. The most common problem that I'm really seeing is like something essential from the assignment not being present in the response. Today also we're going to start off with, like we did last time, we'll talk about some of the responses from the discussion board. I got all the discussion board 5 grades in, and I was able to at least look through again the discussion boards for today. Really like a lot of the stuff that I saw there. Some really amusing fallacies. Some people getting religious. The subject of religion contains many fallacies, it seems. Or at least the people in places of authority tend to use fallacies to maybe, I don't know, convince you of things, or to forward their own agenda about what you should or should not believe. So interesting stuff there. I really liked what I saw. I've got some contenders for fallacy of the day. I've got one in particular that I want to talk about at the beginning. And then we'll talk about today fallacies of not weak induction, fallacies of ambiguity, presumption, fallacies of presumption. And then next time we'll hit, next time I believe it's ambiguity. A couple more sets of those notes left. I've got one set of notes that are just kind of like a grab bag of fallacies that aren't easily classifiable. And then, so by that'll probably take us to the end of the first hour. In the second hour, we'll start talking about, we'll dip back into the rhetorical analysis notes. We'll talk about logos. And then we'll pivot back, and I'll try to cast a wide net and draw in as much as I can about the arguments that we've looked at previously. I'll try to draw some parallels between some of the arguments you read today, some of the strategies that those authors were using, how Logos has been sort of operating in these other arguments that we've looked at. Again, we've like sort of talked about this here and there, but the focus has always been a little bit different. But in particular, I want to show you like what my best rendering of what Bernie Sanders' argument was, my best rendering of what Walsh's argument was, and looking at each of those from like a premise conclusion kind of breakdown to really cut through and show you how much around the argument is really just a matter of pathos and ethos. There's actually very little of logos. It might be one of the more modest parts of the argument in a lot of cases. And sometimes it's not even really just the claims. Sometimes it's just like how the argument's organized. Do they stay on topic? Do they, sort of, is it more unfocused or not? So we'll talk about some of those qualities. That said, Kylie, did you want to address your comment in the chat before we move on, or did I have you sort of resolved it, or was it resolved? I will leave that to you to put in the chat, I suppose. So very excited. I found out how to transmit sound over a screen share in the intervening time, and it worked. But the first thing I want to talk about is, let me go ahead and start the screen share here. Gotcha. All right. So one of the first things I want to do is make that actually. No, I'm trying to move the gallery around. It wants to go lateral on me. There we go. Switch all over here. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is Mike's response was really interesting. You sent me this link, Mike, to this pit bull website, this anti-pit bull website, ban pit bulls. And I think the one thing that I felt like was kind of lacking in the response was like, you kind of gestured broadly to this site and we're like, the appeals that they are using are fallacious and unreasonable. But I didn't get a lot of specifics. But when I looked at this site, this is like a rich tapestry of fallacies. So first of all, you've got this really troubling picture of this pit bull. No pit bulls, right? Pit bull buster. Support breed-specific legislation in the USA and Canada, right? So there's a website with a clear purpose and an audience, right? People concerned about pit bulls, pit bull biting. And then there's all these fast facts, right? Attacks on people, attacks on animals, pit bulls by the numbers. And these are some pretty alarming. So let's be overly charitable. Right. And let's just look at this website, because this is also good because it kind of harkens back to those notes that we had on evaluating websites, reading laterally, right? Traveling up and down vertically on the site, and then maybe reading laterally, like seeing where the links take us and evaluating in that way. Fatal and disfiguring pit bull attacks increased 830% in 7 years, right? Big if true. That's a whole lot of percent, right? So if we follow this link, this is going to take us to something called Animals 24/7, which is apparently some kind of news site. Let's see, about us. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It's incorporated in the state of Washington. It's fully tax deductible. Please feed the kitty. There's a whole lot going on here. Maybe I should contact Beth Clifton and see if they have some kind of social media web manager. There's a lot going on here. They have a comment policy. It looks like maybe here are these people. All right. It looks like these are just like some people that have a nonprofit organization, right? All right, fine enough. But like, I love this. Who is most likely to kill or disfigure you or your child? A jihadi terrorist armed with guns and bombs? A far-right militia member practicing, quote, open carry of weapons? Or a dangerous dog? right? It's like a false trichotomy, right? As if those are like the only three things. But these are like noticing, right? Falling back on our rhetorical analysis strategies, we've got this second person, right? Now the authors are addressing you and your child, right? We have a classic appeal to pity, right? Appeal to like almost it's like a combination of a false dichotomy and an appeal to force, right? You better be primed to accept legislation against pit bulls, or else bad things are going to happen to you, like your children are going to be hurt. And how long have you wanted to hurt your children, right? Just fallacies start stacking up. And what's interesting is if you read through this, right, here's the claim: pit bull attacks up 830%. This is not sourced to anything. Fatal and disfiguring pit bull attacks are up 830% since 2007, when the Humane Society of the U.S., Best Friends Animal Society, and American SPCA ramped up pit bull advocacy after the arrest of football player Michael Vick on dogfighting charges for which he was eventually convicted. Where's the evidence for the 830%, right? It's not there, right? Oh, it's somehow vaguely related to like these three like organizations increased their activity after the Michael Vick conviction. That's not proof or relation to an 830% increase in a thing, right? There's a constant strategy in this particular article, which is not the same people assumedly that own or operate this, but there's a constant lack of citing any sources for things, just throwing out claims without like no way to substantiate the numbers, right? Which if you're the most charitable you could possibly be and say like, well, maybe these people aren't misleading me about any of these facts, that's the only way that you can then grant them the warrant to make the claims that they can. But I think that's being way too generous. You should be scrupulous and demand some kind of evidence for what is otherwise a ridiculous number, right? Like I need some evidence for a number like that. It seems absurd, right? And so I would need some information for that. This one's interesting. In the last 4 months of 2015, pit bulls killed the same number of people as Dobermans killed in 60 years. Aside from the fact that we have no information just in this fast fact that accounts for why that, maybe there's some suppressed evidence that's accounting for this fact. Maybe this is cherry-picked information. Let's follow the link. Let's be generous. Let's see where it takes us. It takes us vaguely to the National Post, which is a sort of like the Canadian equivalent of like maybe the New York Post, maybe the Washington Times. It's like a low tier right-leaning, like somewhat periodical. It's not particularly held up in great journalistic esteem, but also importantly, it just takes us to the homepage. It doesn't take us to a specific article or anything. This is just a bunch of stuff on the National Post. It's not even to an article from the Post that we can then use to assess or verify any particular information. What's the thing? Shirtless Vladimir Putin? This episode is way out of date. Shirtless Vladimir Putin hasn't been funny in like 7 years, right? And so like that's like the constant strategy that I found on this website is there's a lot of logos looking like information, but if we grant them that first provision of evaluating an argument, assuming if true, do the premises relate to the conclusion? If the conclusion is ban pit bulls because they're dangerous, and here's a bunch of premises that show how dangerous pit bulls are, then sure, it seems like maybe there's a validity to these. But then all of these claims fall under inspection. So it seems like most of these are unsound relationships between things, right? I didn't go through and check every one of these. There might be some that are more valid than others. There might be some that actually do link to relevant information. But the first like 2 or 3 or 4 links that I followed, I was like, this doesn't take me anywhere. It doesn't prove anything that they're claiming. Or at best, it takes me to this weird website maintained by these 2 random folk that just don't cite any information for where they're getting statistics. They're just throwing a lot of numbers around and not saying where they're getting any of their data. And like, okay, here's a giant list right here. Like this Harris County, that's in Texas. There's a lot of information here that like is unclear. This is supposed to be all the attacks between 1982 and 2015. This is like some kind of picture. I don't know what this is. The website itself seems to have like very low credibility, and this seems to have like a very specific agenda that they're pushing. So while like I wanted a little bit more specificity out of like which, I think, Mike, you could have picked anything on this website to point to as an example of some kind of fallacy. But I thought this was really interesting that it's like, here are images of victims, right? Here's pity, right? Here's images of danger, right? Here's the appeal to force, right? Like it's just like sort of steeped in lots of like fear and pity and emotional based appeals, right? And it seems there's like the thin veneer of logos, but which falls apart under like even the most, like a strong wind could knock over the evidence that they're providing. So I thought that was really really interesting to go here and see this. I really love we need data on bad websites. So I always love to run into something that's absolutely bonkers. Yeah, it was really bad, right? And maybe somebody has some information about a particular breed of dog is, to me that sounds like it like sort of borders on eugenics, the idea that aggression is an inbred trait like that. I don't know. And it seems more like training and ownership and other factors that like actually produce aggression than just like, this is a pit bull and you must be scared of him, right? Like that's a very like fear stoked kind of argument. It's a very tropey kind of stereotypical thing. So I've got some candidates for fallacy of the day. My first one is Rebecca. Nope, not you. Too early. Go. Is that too loud? Everybody hear that? At this point, I want to ask you, what is this? Oh, well, you can see it up at the top. I was going to say, what is this selling? It seems like the music is sort of this like low, like droning guitar. It's the way that the camera sort of speeds. It's very cinematic, right? It's very much like, it's almost like they got the cinematographer from John Wick to shoot this commercial or something. And like just the way he's dressed, right? The turtleneck, like he's a very like dapper kind of guy. He's very meticulous, right? It almost seems like this is selling you like maybe that rifle, maybe this is like a gun range, maybe it's a clothing commercial. It's kind of unclear. It's for eye drops. I think Rebecca called this an example of the bandwagon fallacy, where she's like, use these eye drops and you could be just like this guy. And I think that's a valid reading of this. I think another way to read this is just simply a non sequitur, right? It's building you up for something and then it's introducing eye drops, which I don't know. Do eye drops do this? Is this what eye drops are for? What are eye drops for?
Hydrating your eyes or clearing redness. They don't make your eyesight better.
Exactly, right? Like it's not, if you use eye drops, they don't like make you have better eyesight. Now it might be a consequence of having irritation in your eyes as it's hard to focus and see straight, but it is certainly false that using these are going to make you into a better marksman on a consistent basis as you're being sold this. I thought that was very amusing, really good, really well done. Man, the Germans, they can do bad reasoning just as well as any of us, can't we? So I thought that was really cool. And then I kind of previewed the next one. This was Misty's, the fallacy of the day, the slippery slope. Stop climate change before it changes you. This is brought to you by the World Wildlife Fund. What is it? What is the argument being made here? Well, what's the heart of this fallacy? Well, let's look at the image. What are we going to turn it? What if we don't stop climate change today? What happens to us in the future?
It's almost like the opposite of evolution. Sorry, Rebecca.
No, it's okay. Maybe pity fallacy, like something terrible want to happen if you don't do it.
I don't really think it's the pity fallacy, because that would, yes, Kat.
Hi, yes.
Go ahead. Or not.
Okay.
Maybe she's not talking to us.
Okay. Yeah, I tried to like contact y'all.
Okay, it seems like maybe that's something else. But yeah, to what you were saying, Rebecca, I don't think it's necessarily the appeal to pity, because it's not saying, look how pitiful this human is. Like, there might be some of that in there, right? Maybe you can make an argument. I think it's a stronger case for the slippery slope. But if you don't stop climate change today, look at this horrible fish monster that you'll become tomorrow, right? It's today's false misstep is tomorrow's inevitably terrible consequence. And I think that was, I always found that, I found this one really amusing. Poor fish guy. And also, this is just backwards, right? This is not what evolution would do to us. We would not. Also, if climate change is like part of climate change is that like the water is becoming more acidified, like the ocean water is subject to acidification. So like it would actually be killing marine life. So it's not like we have to go live in the water. That would be the opposite of what would happen. Like we'd probably have to go like live in mountain caves or something, like far, far above the sea level. It seems to get like backwards, even like the fearful consequences that we're supposed to be averting. Like, I don't know, we don't need any more misinformation in the climate change argument space. So
I feel like it is like false cause. I don't know if we've gone over that one yet, but I looked in the notes, or maybe the one or it's like not connected. I forgot the word for that one.
No, that was the long one. False ad hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this, right? I think it's closer to, so slippery slope is one of the versions of false cause, right? It's saying that there's no real causal connection between what this image is demonstrating and what this premise is starting with, right? And so I think you're really astute to point that out, that there's this imaginary causal connection between these two things. But false hoc or propter hoc ergo prop, I hate Latin. Ad hoc ergo propter hoc, or post hoc ergo propter hoc, is all about like correlation not equaling causation. It's two things occurring very closely in time and attributing one causing the other because they happen to happen at the same time. So like I think this one more cleanly maps on to something like slippery slope, but yeah, it's not the case that any humans are turning into the creature from the Black Lagoon, as Mike says, right? So like if you were to say that like, there's I don't know how you would make it into the other false cause fallacy. Maybe if there were some kind of reptile alien hybrid had appeared on Earth at the same time that climate change happened, and you were to say, yes, climate change is causing the reptile alien hybrids, I could say, no, the reptile alien hybrids are from the constellation Draco. We all know this. Come on, guys, we're fighting the Pleiadians for supremacy of the universe. Get it together, right? So I really enjoyed that one. Yeah, it was me, right? Like, and today we will continue the getting to the bottom of the fallacies of whether or not I am or am not a possible reptile alien. This one, Raquel, I think you have a good example of ad hoc or post hoc ergo propter hoc and I'll leave fish guy up here, or actually, I'll change it. The black cat superstition that you talked about. I think superstitions are really good examples of ad hoc, post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Two that, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. Like I used to know people that would, whenever you went over railroad tracks, they would touch a screw. That was like a thing that people do. You have to like touch a screw when you go over railroad tracks. Don't step on a crack or you'll break your mother's back. And if your mother's back happened to get broken that day, you can attribute one to the other, right? That's false cause, right? That's just two absolutely unrelated things producing. That's a pretty extreme case, but right, it's the appearance of a causal connection just because two things happen to happen close in time. Like I talked to my mom today and she's like, I'm getting sick and I think it's from the vaccine. I was like, you got the vaccine 6 months ago. I don't think you're getting sick because of the vaccine. It's post hoc ergo propter hoc. So maybe if it was a little closer together in time, but even then, right, like some people have adverse reactions to it. Some people, I'm not a doctor, I'm not qualified to say, but 6 months seems a little much. Maybe there's some of that going on. Also, Kylie, the appeal to false authority. This one is real fun. I like this.
Yo, what's up?
I'm just not feeling it.
Which, in case you don't know, this is a very young Drake. And also, this is super cringy. Wouldn't that be bad for electronics? Like if Drake were a weird animatronic rapper, like wouldn't that like short circuit him? Unless he's like somehow all like his hydraulics are powered by Sprite. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. This is terrifying.
Last name ever, first name greatest. Like a sprained ankle, boy, ain't nothing to play with. Started.
All right. That's intense. Drake took one sip of Sprite and realized, I can make a lot of money if I rap about Sprite. The appeal of false authority. There's nothing about like, I think this could be a variety of fallacies, right? It's on the one hand, it's using Drake's celebrity to sell you like on the lifestyle, right? Oh, Drake drinks Sprite and he's a successful rapper. So if I drink Sprite, I can have those blistering insights too. It's also lying to you about the creative process. It never happens like that. I don't know if anyone has ever had inspiration strike that instantly where they just start immediately like spitting out, incredibly polished studio quality like beats and raps like that. That's not how that happens. Even really great freestyling doesn't happen like that. He would need to be yelling at somebody. You have to like be insulting someone in particular. So yeah, and then also that like the Sprite is also like it's kind of a false cause too in a way, right? Like Sprite is somehow triggering of the creative process, right? There's a lot of different appeals that this one I think could be, but this one's, I had a real hard time watching this one. As Abby said, that was absolutely terrifying. Whenever he stopped and became Robot Drake, I audibly laughed. Like I could not stop. It was really bad. So I really enjoyed that one. This one's fun too. This was Abigail H. Abby, ask yourself, is this a compelling argument?
Performance when you need it most. Introducing Playtex Sport tampons, a revolutionary high-performance tampon with 3 degrees to sport-level protection. The first contoured applicator with no slip grip.
No slip grip.
Unique 360-degree coverage. Don't back down, manifest or win. A one-of-a-kind backup layer that won't let you down. Game time, anytime. New Playtex Sport. May the best protection win.
Look how happy and active you could be on your period, right? Nobody has to answer that doesn't want to, but I just from the friends that I've known and the people I've known in my life, menstruation seems to have a different effect on your ability to perform physical tasks. As Abby very deftly points out, this is, not exactly the consequence of using perhaps a more sporty tampon. Maybe it makes things a little bit more easy to, some tasks easy to perform. I don't know if you're going to be on the uneven bars in the Olympics. I don't know, maybe you are. I'm sure some Olympic athletes are menstruating. That's probably really difficult. Should get extra points. But this was really fun. This is, the bandwagon fallacy, the appeal to celebrity. There's other Abigail had a very similar one with the Powerade, which I might not have called that up, but it's the Powerade is very similar to the Sprite commercial, but instead of using the celebrity of somebody to sell something, it's using these powerful athletes who, this person drinks Gatorade, I drink Gatorade by the trans. What word am I looking for? Trans positive? I don't know. I can't remember the word. It's the word that means transposition. Like these attributes now map onto me, and I have those attributes. Transference? I don't know. I can't remember what it is now. But the idea that you see somebody doing something, you do that thing, therefore I will be able to do that thing, right? It's the same kind of idea at work here. So I really enjoyed those. And the last one, before, I have a couple honorable mentions. This was fun. This is Crady's moisturizer commercial. The appeal to, well, let's play it and see.
जब स्किन हो इतनी सॉफ्ट कैसे ना फिसले हर कोई.
Skin so soft the tattoo slides right off, right? I thought that was really amazing. I think part of this is and Credit, I think you're definitely pointing out how this is like clearly a ridiculous thing to believe. I think this is, I think you can make a case again for a couple of different ones, but I think this is kind of an equivocation on what the idea of smooth might mean, or something on that order. I just thought this was, and you'll notice that a lot of these are really amusing, right? Maybe they were cringy, maybe they're like, some of them are a little bit more serious, but a lot of commercials, a lot of advertisement exploit their blatant irrationality for the purpose of humor, right? That's again, another kind of pathos or emotional kind of appeal is humor, right? And the more self-aware those advertisements are, it's weird that the more irrational they are, the more self-aware they are of their irrationality, almost becomes a form of ethos, or they try to sell that as a form of ethos. I have one example of that I want to show us, that is my favorite commercial ever, but it's a Tide ad. This was in the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. It had Stranger Things, Hot Stuff, David Harbour.
Yeah, just your typical Super Bowl car ad, right?
Or a hilarious beer ad.
Or whatever ad this is.
Whatever.
But it's a Tide ad.
What? It's a Tide ad.
What makes it a Tide ad?
There are no stains. Look at those clean clothes. What else would this be an ad for?
Diamonds?
A gift that lasts for
No, Tide.
It's time for a cold, refreshing.
Tide ad.
Fall into the sleep of
No. Tide. No. Tide ad.
extreme.
No. Tide.
Tide!
Meet the all-new.
No, it's a Tide ad. Tide.
So, does this make every Super Bowl ad a Tide ad?
I think it does. Watch and see.
So what's your bit? Jelly, queso?
Sorry, what?
Tide Super Bowl commercial. Gotta have a thing.
Yeah, you know I can't tell you that, Terry.
I had a thing. My thing was barbecue.
Looks like it still is.
Oh, man.
gonna do? There was one more part of it that I thought it was gonna play, but maybe not. There's 4 parts of that ad that go on. They played like one in every quarter. It was really amazing. But they bring it back to like they parody lots of different commercial brands, right? And it's always like, look how clean the clothes is. That's how you know it's a Tide ad. This is a really successful commercial campaign, actually. Like after the Super Bowl itself, this was the most talked about thing that was going on at the same time as the Super Bowl. It's kind of marketing genius. But none of those were actually providing you any evidence other than just, well laundered clothes that were washed specifically to be in these ads. Anyhow, but it becomes like this sort of self-referential kind of like ethos, like, oh, they understand how ridiculous they're being, right? But it's interesting. They're not even selling you like they're selling you laundry detergent, but even more than that, they're selling you the idea that Tide is a fun company, right? Like they're selling you brand loyalty. And that's like the heart of a lot of advertising now, is like not really giving you like insight into the product as much as it's inspiring positive feelings toward brand identity, right? And that's why it's so important to be able to evaluate and distinguish between like what kind of information you're getting, where it's coming from, what the purpose of that information is. Because not only are there visual ads like that, like these are really, I think one of the great things about like visual medium like that is it's relatively simple in a way to point out like, okay, look what's going on here. But there are other kinds of things called native advertising, sponsored content, where it's not at all clear at once that what you're reading is ad copy, or what you're reading is paid for by somebody to say good things about something. Sometimes it comes under the guise of mastheads, like CNN engages in some of this. Like CNN has derivative like sponsored content and native advertising like blogs that they host that use the CNN brand to sell like lifestyle experience stuff, workout experience stuff, like all manner of that. And the internet is like rife with that stuff. Anybody can just like buy a blog and start like hosting native advertising content. It's a wild, wild advertising west out there. So on that note, that primes us, I think, for fallacies of presumption. There's only 3 fallacies of presumption I want to talk about. They are the accident, the complex question, and the confusingly named begging the question, which isn't strictly always a question. But from the logic textbook, some mistakes in everyday reasoning are the consequence of an unjustified assumption, often suggested by the way in which the argument is formulated. That suggestion may be deliberate, or the assumption may be only an oversight. In either case, the upshot is that the reader, the listener, and even the author of the passage may be led to assume the truth of some unproved and unwarranted proposition. In fallacious arguments of this kind, the premise may indeed be relevant to the conclusion drawn, but that relevance is likely to flow from the tacit supposition of what has not been given support and may even be unsupportable. Tacit assumption, tacit being like sort of inherent, maybe not necessarily stated, latent, unrevealed, something you might have to read between the lines for. The presumption often goes unnoticed. To expose such a fallacy is therefore usually sufficient to call attention to the smuggled assumption. The smuggled assumption will be the title of my memoir, or supposition, and it is doubtfulness or its falsity, right? And so that's a lot of words. And a couple examples, I think, will demonstrate what exactly all those words are getting at. Accident, this is sometimes known by the Latin name dicto simpliciter. It's a fallacy in which a generalization is mistakenly applied to a particular case to which the generalization does not apply. So last session, we talked about the hasty generalization. It's the fallacy of reasoning from an atypical sample, a particular, to a generalization. Accident is the exact opposite. You reason from a general and a general rule, and you misapply it to a specific case, right? It's a generalization that's largely true, and it may not apply in a specific case. The reason generalization does not apply in those cases have to do with the accidental circumstances of the case or of those cases. In this sense, the word accident doesn't mean something unintentional. The word accident is, in philosophy, we often talk about accidental properties versus necessary properties. Like if I'm a human, it is a necessary property of me that my mortalness is a necessary property. An accidental property of me is the idea that I'm wearing this polo shirt, right? This is an accidental property. It's something that's relative to change, right? So if something's relative to change or nuance or qualification or condition, it's accidental. It's just, it happens to be the case. It's not necessary to the thing itself. So that's what this language comes out of Aristotle, and that's what Aristotle means when he talks about the accident fallacy. It's something about a particular case that has some sort of conditional nuance to it that is otherwise rebuking a generalization that's largely true, right? So an example of that would be something like, Professor Morgan strongly believes that you should not hurt people. Therefore, I am staunchly against surgery and surgeons, right? Surgery and surgeons with their knives, they're always cutting people open. What are they up to anyway, right? Well, you know, the general provision not to hurt somebody is overruled in this case by the idea that surgery is something that is in order to perform a greater good. They use general anesthesia. There are many provisions taken actually to make sure that you do not feel pain. So there's a lot of mitigating accidental circumstances that are overruling this general idea that, oh, you shouldn't hurt people, right? You know, we have a lot of these, like, you know, we can have a general rule. It's like, you shouldn't kill people, right? Murder is illegal. Well, there are certain circumstances where that provision is overruled, right? There's a lot of self-defense laws. There are a lot of particular, you know, we send you off to war, you go and you kill somebody there, you don't come home, we prosecute you for murder most of the time. You know, the Miley massacre and others notwithstanding. A lot of these are highly subject to political circumstances too. The upshot here is that there's some generalization that generally holds true, but you're ignoring some circumstances that are making that not the case in this case, right? That something isn't relevant, like something is making that rule irrelevant to apply to this case. It's not applicable in total, in the full weight of its words are hard, implications. The complex question. This one is the one, Deborah, have you stopped cheating on your exams, right? This is that fallacy. It's a fallacy in which a question is asked in such a way which it presupposes the truth of a buried question, right? It's a complex question. There are two actual questions being asked. And if you only address one of them, you're committing yourself to this like sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't catch-22 like situation where you're either denying something that you're not intended to, or you're affirming something that you're not intending to, because you're not actually addressing the first question first, right? The only logical response to the when's the last time you start, how long, or when was, have you stopped cheating on your exams, is that I have never cheated on my exams. You have to reject that first premise so that you don't find yourself saying like, I've never, you know, I have stopped cheating, or I haven't stopped cheating, right? If you start answering the secondary question, then you've fallen into the trap. And, you know, if you're in a live debate, the complex question can be incredibly damaging, right? It can make you seem like you're contradicting yourself. If you're on a witness stand, right? If you're in a cross-examination, if you get pulled into a complex question, you can appear to be contradicting yourself in such a way that you lose your authority as a witness, you lose your credibility. And it, you know, for an eyewitness, credibility is the only gold standard for the veracity of your account, right? You lose that, then there's basically like, you're just telling stories. So an example I've got for this one, has Professor Morgan finally abandoned his reptile alien agenda for world domination, right? It presupposes that I have a reptile alien agenda, and that reptile alien agenda is for world domination. Maybe I have a reptile alien agenda for, you know, world ice cream, right? I might be a different kind of reptile alien. This is one I just love because that's a real picture somewhere. Do we really need another reptilian shapeshifter as president, right? These are the questions of our time, right? This is really getting to the heart of the issue. And so the complex question is a little easier to spot in the sense that it is an actual question. Unlike the badly named begging the question. Sometimes begging the question is called circular reasoning. Begging the question isn't necessarily in the form of a question. Almost every time you hear somebody say, well, that begs the question of, they're using that phrase incorrectly. I hear this in podcasts from people that I respect and love, say, well, that begs the question. No, it doesn't. It raises a question. Raising a question is different than begging a question. If you're raising a question, you have a legitimate question that you think that some piece of information suggests further clarification for. Begging the question is saying something to the effect of, Professor Morgan is a reptile shape-shifting reptile alien because he is a shape-shifting humanoid, right? The definition of one of the terms is presupposed by the other. This is the same argument as saying, well, Professor Morgan is cool because he is awesome, right? Well, you have not yet established my coolness or my awesomeness, right? You can't use coolness to affirm awesomeness because coolness is awesomeness, right? They're logically equivalent, right? If you're using two things that are logically equivalent and attributing one to the other, that's circular reasoning, right? Professor Morgan is, well, this one gets at the problem of logic. Professor Morgan is human because he is mortal. I don't know. That's a deeper philosophical question. But the idea of, defining something, somebody said something like this in one of their proposals, like, this is a credible website because it's legit. And I was like, that's like kind of the definition of circularity, right? But it's legitimate because it's credible, and it's credible because it's legitimate. And it's like, well, those two terms aren't really relevantly distinct, like they're not distinguished well enough, right? If you want to say that something is something because of something else, there needs to be a clear distinction between the two things that you're using one to reinforce the other with. Otherwise, you're just saying, you're just going around in a circle, and you're just saying, this thing is awesome because it is awesome. Why is it awesome? Because it is awesome. Because I said so, it's awesome, right? It's kind of like the parents' argument of, do this because I said so. Why should I do it? Do it because I asked you to. Why'd you ask me to? Because I said so, right? It's just endless circles, round and round. What you really want to say is, do it because I'm like in power and you're not. And maybe you can't understand. So that brings us to the end of these today. For the discussion threads, I've sort of opened them up since we have quite a lot of different kinds of fallacies at your disposal. Words are real hard for me today. In the next discussion thread that's going to be due on Thursday, you can choose any kind of fallacy that we talked about. So they can be fallacies of presumption, they can be fallacies of relevance, they can be fallacies of weak induction. We haven't strictly gone on to the next set of fallacies yet, but if you want to, there were a couple, which we got a couple of minutes before we'll take our break, that there were a couple examples of things that we're not going to get to them for at least until next week in today's discussion thread. Alyssa, you talked about how all Christians go to church, or all good Christians go to church, or the church is proof. So going to church is proof that somehow you're good. And I think that's a version of the no true Scotsman fallacy. All Christians go to church. Well, I'm a Christian and I don't go to church. Well, all real Christians go to church, right? It's that moving the definition back and saying, well, okay, well, you're not a real version of this, or you're not included in the authentic set of these things because you don't do this arbitrary thing I've decided. The no true Scotsman is particularly heinous. And it's related to the moving the goalpost fallacy, the idea that every time you present some evidence, somebody pushes back the standard for what they will accept as truth, and they just keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing. It's just moving the goalposts all the way down. Another one that I think that we're going to get to next time, maybe that's the only one that I really want to talk about for that. There was one more, Katie, horse racing kills. I think it's the second Australian website you've used. I was like, is Katie in Australia maybe? Are you just like really into the the ABC's like writing style?
Well, the last one is actually the UK, and this one's Australian.
All right, so you only take fallacies from the greater Commonwealth.
And also billboards. I don't know, that was my thing.
But yeah, I think you were absolutely spot on with the horse racing kills thing. And it also brings up a really good example, since we were talking about the complex question and the begging the question, the idea of what's the role of the rhetorical question. And I'll go down here and pull yours up real quick. And also, yes, trigger warning, tired and possibly dead horse ahead. So is the party really worth it, right? This is real, it's not a complex question, right? There's not a secret question hiding in this question. And it's not circular argument, right? This is what we call a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question, usually when we ask like an open-ended question, like a genuine question, and a question that's not just a query for a yes or no response, right? Or that something that can't be answered with like a specific piece of data, right? What is today, right? I could say today is Tuesday, right? That's a question asked and answered. What is the definition of liberty, right? That's a short answer question. I could write a whole book about that, right? And there could be competing answers for it. If I ask you, is the party really worth it, and show you this image, what is the only answer to the question this question is looking for? No, right? The party is not worth it, right? This is a rhetorical question, just takes what is otherwise a logical, arguable claim, and it frames this as if it's a question, right? You could rewrite this as, well, first of all, the party, we have to define what do they mean by the party. Horse racing is not worth it. That's kind of like a vague pronoun reference. Like, what is it? Horse racing is not worth the risking the lives of horses. That is the claim that's being like sort of buried in the verbiage or the rhetoric of this rhetorical question. And so like the rhetorical question, we generally avoid the rhetorical question in academic writing because it's kind of disingenuous. It is clothing a logical claim as if it were a question worth debate, and it's not a question worth debate. They are leading you, this is objection leading the witness, right? It's almost the complex question, but it's not quite the complex question because it's not one of those false dilemmas where like if you grab onto either response, then you're kind of like, you're not saying something wrong either way, right? If somebody asks me, is the party really worth, like if somebody asks you, is murdering horses actually worth it? And you said yes, then you're just committing yourself to the other person's framing of murdering horses, right? And you're sort of committing yourself. I guess you could say that you're just, whatever, I'm being edgy. Yeah, I believe horse murder is righteous. That's a hard position to defend. So it's asking a question in such a way that it's leading you towards a specific answer that if you answered in the opposite way that it's leading you, you are going to look very bad, right? So it's not quite the complex question. It's not quite a fallacy. It's a rhetorical strategy designed to deceive people into thinking you're being reasonable. It's like when I see rhetorical questions, I start it sends a lot of red flags to me about the sincerity and the credibility of the person asking the rhetorical question, because I'm like, you're either being funny intentionally or you're being deceptive. So there's like no real reason to be using rhetorical questions other than just you have your point and you're making it and you're being kind of smug about it. Like, I don't know, there's a smugness to the rhetorical question that I personally don't
Yeah,
like.
and one thing I want to add though is I initially, when I was looking into this billboard, it was I thought it was implying like, you're overworking the horses like on the track. But when the horseracingkills.com, it's like organization to help save the horses, but they are actually referring to that a lot of the horses go to like get slaughtered after they were tired.
Right.
And so I was like, So I feel like the rhetorical question that they use doesn't really give you like what they're trying to actually talk about. It's not really the correct rhetorical question that they really need to, if they were trying to make their point more clear.
Right. Like you would figure if they want to really like drive home, like why the ambiguity at all, right? Just say what you're trying to say. Maybe that has to do with like, you know, public, like, I don't want to say aesthetics, but like there might be standards in Australia and Melbourne that prevents you from saying things like that very explicitly. Like, you know, it's different places have different standards that govern like what you can and can't say in public spaces. Maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's a form of like, look, we, you know, this isn't like nice language in like common society or something. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. Like deferring to the rhetorical question, and it's the way that it's vaguely asked. Like, yeah, I mean, the image is powerful. The word party is very like biased language, but you know, it could be. I think if you phrase that as the claim that it's trying to be, I think the claim is like damning enough, right? Is the fun you're having at the horse races worth slaughtering lots of horses for glue or whatever? You know, that's just, you know, maybe even ask the question like that or something like that. I think it's still a rhetorical question, but I, you know, I think the point still stands that it's a little bit vague and it's a little misleading. So on that note, let's stop there. And now that we're all hungry for logic, right? We've seen nothing but emotion and credibility. Let's get to the heart of the issue and fallacy. Let's get to logic. So let's take 10. We'll reconvene at 7:07, and then we'll start talking about claims and conclusions. I'm late, said the White Rabbit. Welcome back. So, I got your message, Travis. You're very welcome. I'm going to head fake that start and refill my tea. I'll be right back. Okay. Oh, did Peter Gray brew my tea? Because that's weak tea. Just kidding. Peter Gray is the name of the guy that wrote the video game addiction article from Psychology Today. Yeah, I know. So amusing. It's so hard. It's hard to keep up. I empathize. So let's look at some notes about logos. First, a note about patterns of development. Something I noticed in the first couple of rhetorical analysis that I looked at, and again, I've only looked at 3, which is, I don't want to draw a hasty generalization from an atypical sample. However, the things that I noticed immediately were the summaries seem really good. There's one of them that I think bordered on mischaracterization. But sometimes mischaracterization is just, a word or a phrase or overstating something. We'll look at some more examples of this next time when I have a little bit more student examples that I can pull from and maybe show you some things that are some opportunities to do something different or things that are going particularly well. I think on the whole, though, the thing that I took away from the 3 I read was generally the summaries are pretty good and the paragraph organization is really strong. I see people really are strong responding to the pie paragraph model. They seem to have read that and implemented that. I'm seeing the thesis statements in the right place. I'm seeing a nice progression through the summaries, even if I think some of the points of the summary may be exaggerating or otherwise oversimplifying. I think those are really good. One of the things I'm noticing kind of consistently, at least in the first 3, is the pattern of analysis is not exactly what I was looking for. So I will point you back to these patterns of development notes, especially these notes on division and analysis, because this is what we're doing, right? We're dividing a text into its parts. And what are those parts? The parts we're looking at are logos, ethos, and pathos. The appeal to credibility, the appeal to reasoning, and the appeal to emotions, right? Those are the parts of the text. That's what it's composed of, right? So we're trying to, and I'm trying to show you that there's a way to look at these 3 distinctly, but the boundaries between them are a little bit fuzzy. You can look at one thing from many different perspectives. But in terms of strategies for division, so this is something you could bring to bear on how you're looking at any particular appeal, right? What are the parts, right? The part under consideration in this next assignment is ethos, right? That's the part you're looking at. What is the ethos like, right? So you're analyzing the tone. You're analyzing how is the author using language to build themselves as a credible source. And ethos like questions like that. How is it arranged, right? What's the strongest part of their ethos? What's the weakest part of their ethos? And then in terms of analysis, asking that next question, why is it arranged in this way? Why is it persuasive or not persuasive, right? Is it actually working? How do these things relate to or reinforce each other, right? How does the authoritative tone reinforce the other strategies of credibility that the author's using? How do their personal credentials work together with their tone? And Jonathan Garlick's essay is the one you'll be analyzing for ethos, right? How is his personal credentials reinforcing the way that he is developing his content, or the way that he's using his personal and professional experience? Those are the kinds of concerns that I'm really looking for in that analysis paragraph, and then using instances of language from Garlick's essay and then doing analysis of that. Here's an example of strong tone. Why is it strong tone? Well, it's strong tone because he said this and this in this particular way, which was supported later by this, right? I'm looking for you to draw together and synthesize. And that seems to be like for all of the very limited set that I've looked at, the incorporation of quotes looks really good. Like y'all are using signal phrases very effectively. But the thing that I kind of noticed almost immediately was doing the carpet bombing quotes, like one quote after another quote after another quote, and like not really stopping for analysis, or trying to do all your analysis at the very end. And it's like, well, what is this analysis like tied to? Which quote are you really concerned with here? Or talking about how the author's appeal to the emotion made really valid logical points. And it's like, well, that's two different things we're talking about there, right? Their emotional appeal might support their logic, but in the analysis of their emotional appeal, we're not really concerned with how valid the logic is. We're concerned with what story is the author telling us? What emotion is the author provoking, right? How is the emotion that the author tries to evoke in the beginning related to the, where they end up at the end, right? Maybe that in the broadest sense, like how is that supporting their overall point? But it's less about the validity of the point, and it's more about like, how is the author telling us a story that's illustrative of the idea that they're trying to get across. Does that distinction make sense that I'm trying to make there? It seems that there's a little confusion, I sense. I'll probably get a better sense of criticism after reading more of the essays. But it's just something I wanted to point out, that like use these deeper notes also as a guide too for the way that you're approaching some of the content, especially this one's on analysis, because rhetorical analysis it's a species of analysis. It's a kind of description, right? And summaries are also using, they're describing ideas, they're describing things, they're telling me what something is like, and the thing that is like something is the text you're reading, right? What are you describing? Like, what ideas do you need to sort of elaborate on in a more robust way? Otherwise, like I said, I'm seeing a lot that I like, which is great. So rhetorical analysis. Let's get to this last one. Logos. Back to Mr. Aristotle. Persuasion is effected through the speech itself when we have proved a truth or apparent truth by means of persuasive arguments suitable to the case in question, right? And logos is the one that's like really concerned with how does the premise relate to the conclusion? How coherent is the piece of writing? Does the author wander around a whole bunch? Is it focused, or is it like not very cohesive? Does it decohere as you read further through it? Is it look at that? Is it organized well in terms of like, does it have like headings in it? Does it have like easily understandable reference information, stuff like that? Like the way that the physical text is organized is also important. Is there a lot of spelling errors? Is it very difficult to understand the grammar of the claims that are being made? I noticed there was like a couple of sentences in student responses. There was one sentence that I puzzled over for like 6 minutes, and I was like, I have to move on. I have to flag this as like, I don't really follow what you're saying here, and I'm moving on. It's like, I think I know what you're saying. I don't know. It's a lot of interpretation. Logos. It comes from the Greek for word or statement or reason. Fun fact, the beginning of the Gospel of John, in the beginning of the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That word is the Logos. It literally in Greek is beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. It's interesting. Gospel of John is pretty interesting. Anyway, it's where we get words like word, statement, reason. It's where we get words like dialogue, like logos in the middle of that. The word logic itself comes from the Greek word logos. It's the quality of being rational, the quality of being reasonable. The rational appeal is concerned with specific evidence, claims, and the logic of an argument. What is the structure like? How is it organized? When evaluating logos, it's important to examine the debatable claims that the argument makes and the specific examples used to support them. Manipulative rational appeals are subject to numerous fallacies of weak induction, presumption, and ambiguity, right? And these are all about like how well defined are the terms you're dealing with, right? Does the author take time to define the specific ideas that are involved in like their deductive reason, right? We looked at how important the idea of definitions are to reasoning deductively. Establishing something like common sense only works to such an extent that sense is common, that we all understand the same definitions of words that we're all using. If an author's using common words in a really weird way, maybe they're engaging in some hasty generalizations. Maybe they're engaging in some equivocations. Maybe there's a little bit of fuzziness at the edges of their concepts where there could be a little bit more specificity. So questioning logos, and there's a couple more questions that we could even ask ourselves. We could even ask ourselves, like, how is the physical structure of the draft put together, right? Do they use paragraphs to break up different ideas, or am I just reading a wall of text? Do they use like common conventions of writing, like, indentions, an easily readable font, decent color contrast that makes it easy to read their content, right? If somebody publishes a website with a white background and all of their content is in bright yellow, it's going to be difficult to evaluate what they're saying, because it's wild to try to like pick through that and read it, right? Is it all written in Comic Sans? Font can undercut your credibility, which in turn damages your reasonableness. So there's other even formatting kinds of questions that you can that relate logos and ethos together. But in terms of like what the argument is, right? Figuring out what the main claim is, that's right, the most important. You can backtrack from the main claim. Once you understand like what's the thing that the author most wants to prove or most wants to convince you of, right? There's bound to be subsidiary arguments, claims being made, maybe not even full arguments. Maybe in the course of a particular writing, there will be just lots of claims thrown out that don't really go anywhere. They're not really part of the main argument. So figuring out what that main thing is that's sort of uniting everything together, and then backtracking and saying, okay, well, here's the conclusion that the author is getting to. Now, where are these premises that are supposed to be pointing me in this direction, right? So where's that at? And asking yourself those two questions about validity or soundness, or about cogency and strength, right? First of all, figuring out what kind of argument you're fundamentally dealing with. Is it mostly deductive? Is it predictive? Is it inductive? Or is the author trying to use like lots of different kinds of arguing strategies? Maybe it's a deductive argument that leads to an inductive argument. Often that's the case. Is there an argument about cause and effect at the heart here? Is it an argument where the author's making analogies? The arguments we looked at today, the ones about video game addiction, really hinge on definition and analogy, right? We'll look at, I've got some particular premises of other arguments or other like sort of premises and conclusions that we'll look at from the last couple of weeks that I want to pause over. But I think that Gray and, I've already forgotten her name, Young, Gray and Young in particular, like if you agree with the way that they're defining the issue, and you agree with the analogies that they're making, then that reasoning might be more persuasive to you. If you disagree with one or the other, and they're ground floor definitions and assumptions, then the rest of their argument might be a little bit more difficult to accept just on the logic of it, no matter what other language that they're throwing at you to move your emotions in some way, or how they're establishing themselves as a credible, trustworthy person, right? The logic just might fail if you're like, this just doesn't compute, right? These claims just don't, like, this definition falls apart. This is not the way that I would characterize this. And then what ambiguities or fallacies are present in the author's logic? And this is really where the rubber meets the road, and where I want to take a sort of hard pivot and talk about Gray in particular. Before I do that, though, I did want to ask a general question. You can answer in, you can answer unmuted, or you can say in the chat. Video games, addictive or not addictive? Which one of these guys, or non-gender specific guys, which one of these authors did you find either of these compelling, like a simple yes, no for like video games, addictive, not addictive? Video games addictive?
I found it, I was challenged by one of the articles on what the term addictive actually means.
Okay.
And so
I like where you're going.
it just seems like from just a general population standpoint, yes, they can be addictive because it's something that we get drawn to and drawn into, but an actual addiction, no, I don't think so anymore.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I like the complicated answer there. I'm getting a lot of, it's interesting. I get a lot of yeses on the addictive. Maybe a corollary question to this. Are we gamers? Do y'all play games? Do y'all play video games? I'm getting a no. Deborah, no. Travis, of course. Katie, sort of. Sometimes, yes, often, not really, no. It's a pretty mixed bag. 2K for life. It personally got addicted. No, I get that. I've had, I've for years, I got introduced to Sid Meier's Civilization series in elementary school, and I cannot quit Sid Meier's Civilization. I have very strong opinions about Civilization 5 as being the best real-time strategy game of all time. Very complicated feelings about Sid Meier's Civilization 6, which was a little cartoony for my taste, and a little busy. But also some very rough times in my life playing the Madden NFL series, being very frustrated by the physics engine, knowing pretty well that he caught that ball, computer. Very frustrating. But yeah, I'm not a super avid gamer. I'm sure that there's some of you out there that are currently on a Minecraft server or something right now. Maybe you're encountering that, maybe you're streaming the class through Minecraft. I think if you've played any video games, I think if you played any video games, you might have some subtle distinctions that you would hope that people that study video games or are making kinds of arguments like Gray and Young might be sensitive to, that I think maybe Young is a little bit more sensitive to than Gray. On that note, let's talk about some claims. Oh, this is the wrong one. So here's Peter Young, PhD. He looks nice enough. Video game addiction, does it occur? If so, why? The analogy of video game addiction to gambling addiction is misleading, right? So right before we even start, we have this idea that there's an analogy at the heart of this argument, that something about comparing gambling and video games, according to Gray, is incorrect, right? If your argument rests on this analogy, he is going to say that argument is invalid, right? Or in this case, since it's an argument from analogy, it would really be that it's a weak argument. It's a weak analogy to say that video games are like gambling. So whether or not the analogy is actually weak, it's really going to depend on, well, what's the definition of gambling? Or what's the definition of a video game? And if those things cannot be defined in terms of each other, then maybe he's on to something, right? And so he starts off with this experts, in scare quotes, already very hostile at the beginning to a particular kind of framing of this issue. Experts, especially those quoted frequently by the media, he doesn't put scare quotes on the media, but I read them there, are constantly warning us of the dangers to our kids. What usually grabs our attention and instills fear in our hearts are the case stories they present. Some child somewhere was out playing without a parent nearby and was abducted and murdered. Therefore, anyone who allows his or her child to play outside, not closely watched by an adult, is a negligent parent. Some distraught young man in South Korea plays a video game for 50 straight hours without stopping to sleep or eat, goes into a cardiac arrest and dies. Therefore, video games are addictive, dangerous, and we must either ban them or curtail their use so our children don't die like that poor South Korean, right? So there's a little bit of pathos going on here, right? He's telling us some stories to frame the issue, telling us some stories to frame some logical conclusions that he wants to, well, they're not logical conclusions. He's framing these as fallacious reasoning, right? He's saying that, like, oh, these are hasty generalizations that the media pushes and experts push, that, oh, from this one atypical example, now we have the slippery slope argument, right? Today's video games are tomorrow's horrible, debilitating threats to our children, right? And it also happens that this South Korean kid who dies, he comes up in the Young article, right? This is a real thing that happened in South Korea, apparently. And this was published in 2012. Young's article, I think, is a little bit earlier earlier, even September 11th, 2009, that other thing that happened on September 11th, that one time, 2009, not 2001, it's a different September 11th. But so he's framing himself as like his ethos that he's building here is he's the great myth smasher, right? Look at these falsehoods, or look at the, not necessarily falsehoods, but look at this defective reasoning that is popular, and I'm going to show you why this popular reasoning is defective. So he points out very deftly, I think this is pretty good, right? Okay, this is anecdotal evidence, right? You know, this is 1 in 7 billion people this happens to. You can't take this as the norm, right? You can't take this story that we tell as the norm if it's just one isolated case study. Later on, he'll go on to actually talk about some case studies in a way that might seem inauthentic, because he like starts off, deriding using case studies as anecdotal evidence, and then down here he talks about, for instance, some adults devote far more time to their careers than the otherwise might. An illustration of this idea, a British gaming researcher has one case of Martin, an 11-year-old boy whose mother was concerned about the huge amount of time he was devoting to World of Warcraft. It seems like he's kind of doing the same thing here, but the difference is this is one case study from a large sample size that he's talking about. So the case study is meant to be indicative of the trend that this study illustrates. Whereas up here, he's painting these as isolated case studies that aren't really based on anything. They don't come out of research. One's just one he's making up, and one is like a real news headline that people are using to draw conclusions, right? And so this is there's a different quality to the way anecdotal evidence is being used here. One, I think this is good. I think what he starts off with, pointing this stuff out as a way to badly use anecdotal evidence, I think that's good. And in a way later where he points out, like he uses anecdotal evidence as an example of a larger study, I think that's also good, right? I think he can do both of those things and not be committing the same like error later that he's pointing out that other people are doing up here. And I think he does that well. And then he talks about, the idea that like video games are very, very popular. And that a small percentage of people that play these video games have some negative experiences with them. And by negative experiences, I'm being a little underselling the idea that people are experiencing suicidal thoughts and depression, and generally terrible things happen to some people that play video games. Some people would even argue that the people are becoming addicted to video games. And he's worried about whether or not there's also some confirmation bias happening. He says for many years now, researchers have been trying to prove that video games are bad, right? So we're starting from a position, video games are bad. Now we're just he's charging that scientists are designing studies that are just geared towards uncovering how they're bad, right? This is just confirmation bias. It's a version of making up your mind about a thing and not letting the data guide you to a conclusion. It's looking for the conclusion you're trying to prove, rather than doing experiments of what he calls well-designed experiments that reveal information. They've already got a conclusion, they're just looking for that information. And then he talks about how the Supreme Court and I think the Australian government, Katie, I'm sure you'd love this, the Australian government and the US Supreme Court have both ruled after looking at the data that they can't determine a causal connection between video game violence or exposure to video game violence and actual real world violence. So then he points out what he calls some well-founded research, right? And so I think he's working to like build his case here. And this is like really the first part of, I think like some really powerful logos in his favor, right? Deferring to the Supreme Court or the Australian Supreme Court, I think it's interesting. This borders on sort of anecdotal just because the Supreme Court thinks that something is a certain way. I'm sure as recent evidence or events have maybe proved to you, maybe what the Supreme Court thinks might not be the truth. Or maybe it's questions of law aren't necessarily the same as questions of right. this is interesting, maybe not particularly compelling, right? The Supreme Court isn't a scientific study. It's a panel of some rather arbitrarily selected people who read good. It's about all we've got going on there. But this is very interesting. Perhaps the most well-designed research study to date aimed at finding a causal effect of video game violence and real-world violence is by Christopher Ferguson at Texas A&M International, which will soon be published in the Journal of Psychiatric Research. His group followed a sample of 165 young people over a 3-year period, assessing their video game play and various other aspects of their lives. They found no relationship at all between exposure to violent video games and real-world violence committed by those young people. They did find that the subject real-world violence was rather strongly predicted by the real-world violence they were exposed to, right? So what's interesting about this study is that there's evidence that real-world experience with violence predicts strongly your ability or your tendency to engage in real-world violence. But simulated violence apparently is not predictive of your behavior to actually commit more violence. That's interesting, right? Big if true. And I'm much more comfortable finding this piece of evidence compelling than I would something like Mike's Pitbull's website that he showed us, which made all sorts of ridiculous logos-looking claims, but weren't really backed up by anything. But just it seemed like so much solid melts into air upon the smallest scrutiny, right? This is interesting, and we've got a citation. I know a lot about this study by the way he's framed it. I think this is a lot of good ethos supporting strong logos, right? This is a good claim. There's little evidence that simulated violence leads to real-world violence. Now, that's not really the point that he's trying to make in the overall essay. Is the point he's trying to make is about addiction, but it's very interesting to see that there is some evidence that just because you're exposed to violence doesn't mean you're going to commit that violence. So there's another part of this essay where he talks about how this is only kind of unique to video games. If you read too many books, people aren't like, oh, those newfangled, well, I mean, depending on who you are, I guess, but there are people reading Harry Potter novels that people legitimately think are engaging in wizardry and witchcraft. But that beside the point, right? That usually if you're reading a lot of books, people aren't like, oh, he's been reading a lot of Tom Clancy novels. Now he started spying on the Soviets, right? Now he's going to start killing off like undercover agents or something like that. So it's kind of unique to video games. Video games are the latest, but there's always kind of like a cultural panic about exposure to media, right? Violent movies being predictive in some cases, people trying to charge that exposure to violent movies, violent TV shows, violent images just in general are predictive of whether or not you'll engage in violent behavior yourself. It's sort of the 1984 argument of exposure to mass media violence. Like we can, or I guess it's really more of like the Clockwork Orange argument. That's the one where they like sit the guy down in the chair and they like put his eyes open and they like force him to watch a whole bunch of violent movies and they like brainwashes him and now he's like, Alex is a nice boy. I don't know. Watch Clockwork Orange, it's wild. Anyway, dystopian fiction. That's not the important part. That's an interesting prelude to the actual argument. And this is getting at what Deborah was talking about. What really is this definition? The Clockwork Orange is very traumatizing. The experience of reading Anthony Burgess is traumatizing. So much so to the extent that I will probably never read another Anthony Burgess novel again. It's also very difficult to read because he makes up this weird future slang where all of a sudden you're like, me and my droogs were in the milk bar. And it's just like, what are you talking about, Anthony Burgess? It's wild. But what Deborah was talking about earlier about complicating this idea of like, well, what is addiction, right? That's one of the important definitions that we're going to need to talk about here. What's addiction and what is the nature of the video games? He talks about, addiction is a word used in a variety of ways, but it generally refers to a compulsive drive to take some substance or engage in some activity that is clearly not good for us and maybe be ruining our lives. That is going to be very important, right? There's two ideas. There's two sufficiently important ideas in this definition. And it's the idea that there is a compulsive drive, or it's three ideas really. It's a compulsive drive, there's a substance involved, and that engaging in behavior that is not good for us, right? It's the sort of three-part definition of addiction, right? It's compulsive, it's chemically motivated, and it's creating behavior that's not good, right? So if all, whether or not all three of those things need to be present at all times in all addictions is what he's going to talk about, because really it comes down to this idea of, is addiction, introducing a substance absolutely necessary in order to call something an addiction, right? Because if that's the case, then now I don't know. We have another complication behind that, but that's where we'll start off with this. The cleric's examples of addiction, of course, are chemical addictions, where people become physiologically dependent on some chemicals, such as alcohol, nicotine, or heroin. But increasingly, and with some good reason, psychologists have begun to apply the term addiction to harmful behaviors that seem to become compulsive, even though no chemical is consumed. And perhaps the best is addictive gambling. So, right, there's this idea that he's trying to sort of get around the accident fallacy, right? And we have a general rule. Addiction is, here's the general rule for addiction. And gambling addiction seems to violate this because you're not taking a substance, right? Now, so he's trying to account for, well, now here's a thing that we're considering addiction that doesn't totally fit this model that we've outlined, this definition that we've outlined. And many fine people are saying that video game addiction is much like this thing, right? It's much like this idea of gambling addiction. And so then he goes on to define gambling addiction. They gamble away all their money, then they borrow and gamble more, they go deeply into debt. This kind of gets at, I can't remember whose discussion thread response was, but it was about addiction. It was about casinos, it was about gambling. And it was about how casinos are fallacious, which I think was vague because I don't think casinos themselves are fallacious. There is something called the gambler's fallacy, which is kind of what he's hinting at here. But I have some thoughts on casino games that we'll get to. He says that people feel compelled to gamble may do it because they see no other possible route out of their debts, and because of the thrill comes whenever they win, which motivates them to seek that thrill again. Compulsive gambling is very serious and prevalent problem, although this hasn't prevented state legislation from promoting gambling in order to add to state coffers, right? It seems like he's sort of, this is not part of his logic. This is just how he personally feels about state governments using something irrational to promote tax revenue. Many, if not most, researchers who support the concept of video game addiction draw an analogy between video game playing and gambling. In fact, much of the research purporting to assess the prevalence of video game addiction, including the much touted recent study in Singapore, has employed the same questionnaire that is used to assess the prevalence of gambling addiction, changing only the word gambling to video gaming. This analogy may be tempting to people who don't know much about video gaming. From a distance, playing a video game looks a little like a gambling at a video screen in a casino, but think of the differences. And now here is probably the most important couple of paragraphs in the entire essay, because this is where he lays out, this is the distinction between video gaming, the definition of video games, and the definition of gambling. First of all, most gambling games, especially the ones that people become addicted to, are pure games of chance. For all except the very few who figure out some way to cheat. They are rigged in such a way that over the long run, you will always lose, but in the short run, you will sometimes win. This is excellent research indicating that the random, unpredictable nature of these rewards operates on the brains of some people to promote behavior that might be reasonably called addictive. The irrational thinking that accompanies behavior and cannot be refuted is this: the very next time I pull the lever, I could hit a jackpot, so I'll pull it one more time, and then one more time, and then one more time, ad infinitum, right? The gambler's fallacy, which is something we'll look at later, is related to this idea that in any behavior, in any situation where you're dealing with pure chance, that you think that the odds are becoming more stacked in one direction or the other the longer you engage in the activity. I'm sitting at the slot machine and I have one to a million odds of hitting, and so I hit the button, I pull the lever, and I lose. So I think the next time and the next time, and maybe I've been there for an hour and a half, and I'm like, now it's primed, right? It's bound to hit. That idea that it's bound to hit, that's the fallacy. Every time you pull the lever, you have a 1 in a million chance of winning. So it's incredibly bad against you. There's never a case where you pull the lever and then your odds are increased for the next lever, right? That, if you were able to somehow develop the idea that you have a better chance of winning the longer you play a game, that is a game of skill. And that is exactly what he's getting at in this next part, right? Games of skill are things that you can get better at over time. Games of skill are like chess or any other game, which success depends on perseverance, intelligence, practice, and learning, and not chance, right? The rewards are not random, they're earned. To move up to the next level, you have to work hard. Moreover, the rewards in video games, as in chess, are purely in-game rewards. They're rewarding only because they signal mastery. Winning in these games doesn't produce real-world riches, and more to the point, failing in these games doesn't lead to debt. That is why video games and chess are truly play, while gambling is not. Now, that I think is really important, right? General question, not a rhetorical question. Are all video games like chess?
No.
And why would you say no? Or can you give me an example of a game that is not like chess, or maybe a definition of a game that like chess doesn't meet?
I would, with my limited knowledge of games, I would think Minecraft. You're building a world, you're being creative, you are, I mean, assumedly.
Sure. We'll assume creativity for the sake of charity.
Well, but I also could be on shaky ground here because I don't play a lot of games, but in the way that I understand chess, you're trying to best your opponent through logic, but also through understanding the person and how they are going to react to what you do. It's very much a give and take, whereas I feel like some video games, it's less a give and take and more of just you doing things.
I think that's a really good informal example, right? Especially with the subjective component of chess, right? Like anyone, this is where I think the deficiency of his definition of a game of skill is this idea that all video games are like chess. I think there are some video games that are kind of like chess, right? Like, let's just take the psychological factor out of chess for just a second. We'll come back to it. We'll put it on the table. But like, it's like, what is chess? There's a goal, right? There's a limited set of moves that can be performed. There's a board which has boundaries and definitions. There's rules. It's very much a rule-governed activity, right? There are certain things that you cannot do in order to win. There are certain strategies that you have to engage into in order to win. There's a variety of, like, if you get really into chess, there's openings. There's you could start with the Sicilian defense. You could start with the Queen's Gambit. If you're so bold, you can open with the King's Indian, which I've been trying to figure out exactly how to play against. There's a lot you can do, right? Like and I think the biggest takeaway from the way that you describe that and like this analogy with chess is that, generally there's two players on opposing sides. There's a goal, there's a set of strategies, and there's a clear way to win and lose, right? That applies to games like Tetris. That applies to games like, I'm thinking of video games like Tetris, Pong, like a lot of the older video games, like the first generation sort of arcade cab games, Pac-Man, even some of the later ones, like, side-scrolling, like games like Sonic, Mario, Metroid, even to an extent games like Streets of Rage, if you ever played Sega Genesis. It's a lot of like picking up knives and stabbing gang members in the dystopian future. It's awesome. I love Streets of Rage. Then you have like fight games, right? You've got like Killer Instinct, Mortal Kombat. Like these are very clearly chess-like in a way. There's strategies, even the button mashers. Like there's some analogy I think you can make with chess. But then you have, like Deborah says, like Minecraft, where there's not a clear goal. You're just kind of in the game, right? You're experience gaming, right? This is kind of more like a game like Young is talking about. This is when she says, in the 1980s, games such as Centipede, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong were popular. Single-player games against a machine, where getting good only meant a high score, improvement of hand-eye coordination. And then they evolved into experiences where gamers could become immersed in a virtual world that they helped create, such as Doom or Quake. And even Doom and Quake, like I think the analogy to chess kind of holds with Doom and Quake, even though there was like limited ability to build worlds and customize characters. There's still a goal that you had to engage in. Whereas, and now I'm thinking of games like Grand Theft Auto, where, there's a game for GTA, but nobody plays GTA for the game. They play it so they can steal cars and like shoot people. And that's what almost everyone I've ever seen play GTA. That's just what you do. You just sure, there's like a storyline you can follow, but you have the option to not follow that storyline, and you can just mess around in the world. You can just go, you can fly a plane. You could I don't know, play radio set. There's games where you could you could learn how to fish for hours in the game. And that's all you do. It has nothing to do with any the main goal of moving the game forward towards a resolution or anything like that. And then you get into really meta stuff like Second Life, which Second Life is just purely social media experience living on a virtual website. You just create an avatar, and that avatar just hangs out on a couch with people. It's basically social media, right? And I think there's a relevant question. This was written before really social media was, 2012 there was definitely social media, but it's definitely different now 10 years later. I think there's a relevant question to ask. I think it raises the question, not begs the question, that is social media itself gamified in a way that breaks this definition of chess is like video games, right? If social media is more like video games, there seems to be you can get likes, there's goals in a certain sense, there's strategies of success and failure. I can apply this definition of game to social media. I can apply this definition of game to social media. I think social that lived experience in the digital environment, I think really complicates both of these arguments. And I think at the end of the day, I think this one is a little bit more permissive of that complication, whereas he has a very strict idea of what games are. And if you reject this definition of games, then I think his argument starts to fall apart a little bit. Because if that analogy doesn't hold, then what he's saying isn't really logical. The analogy is just weak, right? And so that brings me to what I think his premises are. What his premises are he says that games can be addictive, right? Games are one of the things that has the possibility of being addictive. And so 1, 2, and 3, 1 and 2 are our major premise. 3 is our conclusion. And then these are some subsidiary arguments that you kind of have to accept in order for his premises to also be true, right? There are little smaller arguments that are involved. They're corollary arguments that sort of prove these are the conclusions of these other arguments, right? So, games of chance can be addictive. Video games are not games of chance. Therefore, video games can't be addictive. That's his whole argument, right? Kind of wrapped up in a nutshell there. And then each of these, I think, we can bore down a little bit further in them. What does he say? Addiction means compulsive, harmful behavior, right? That's the most liberal definition that he gives. It's the one that doesn't include chemicals, right? It's the one that includes video or gambling as one kind of addiction. Games of chance promote compulsive, harmful behavior. Therefore, games of chance can be addictive, right? That's just, if you admit the possibility that games of chance can be addictive, that's kind of the line of reasoning that you have to take to get there from the definition of addiction. In terms of video games are not games of chance, video games are games of skill. Chess is a game of skill. Video games are like chess. Video games are games of skill, right? That's the line of reasoning. If you don't believe that video games are like chess, then it becomes very difficult to accept this, that video games are all games of skill, right? If you can complicate that premise, then all of a sudden this chain of reasoning is on shaky ground. If video games are not all games of skill, and games of skill are not all games of chance, then video games are not games of chance, right? If you've complicated that first premise, and that first premise might be false, all of a sudden this might be false. If that might be false, then this might be false. And if that's false, then this is false. Right? So that's the problem of all the connections, of all the interconnections of the argument, right? If you accept the definition and you move through each line of the chain of reasoning, there is one piece of reasoning that if this is shaky, the whole thing falls apart, right? If all video games don't conform to this, then, I think at best you could say, his chain of reasoning might be interesting, but it's really reliant on this analogy of all video games are like chess. And if not all video games are like chess, it makes it really difficult to accept his entire line of reasoning, right? He also clearly hasn't relevantly distinguished to me that you know, how video games are any different than just like video gambling, right? Even the pure games of chance, right? We could talk about just casino games. Not all casino games are games of pure chance, right? There's some casino games that are games of pure chance, right? There's roulette, the little ball thing that spins around. That's chance, right? There's nothing predictive there. There's roulette, there's craps, that's throwing dice. It's just dice, right? Dice are random. Yeah, maybe you disagree. Maybe you don't even get off the ground with this, right? If you reject that premise like that early on, if you reject his definition, then nothing follows, right? And so it's like it kind of depends on if you're looking at the specific like structure of the argument. You kind of have to figure out, you know, where's that first premise that the whole argument rests on, and like where does it take you? And like if at any given time one of those things is weak that a lot of other things depend on, that's where you have to attack the logic of the argument, and you have to seize on this definition and say, hey, wait a minute, I can't accept this conclusion if I can't accept this definition of prediction, right? Hey, I can't accept the second major premise of your argument if this analogy between chess and video games don't hold, right? You know, maybe that is the case, but it's a weakness in your reasoning, right? That's really the upshot of the logic. Yeah, and I think like this is also where, you know, despite his failure, I think, to persuade me through his argument, I think there's some green lights in his favor about his ethos. I think generally his ethos is kind of fine. There are some ways that I could criticize his ethos when he starts talking about like, oh, suddenly one day we're making all things pleasurable illegal, then we're all going to be Puritans, and then you'll be great being a Puritan, and like that part of his argument seems very fallacious and very slippery slopey, and maybe intentionally for humor is what he's playing at there. But the other article had
I have one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Honestly, I don't really trust his actual expertise, even though he does have a PhD, which is a degree in philosophy, but and that can be like kind of psychology type stuff, like research. But the thing that I feel like he would need to qualify as like someone that knows what he's talking about is if he had a certificate in like chemical dependence, because he kind of goes over like all these like what addiction is, but that's not his expertise. Even though he may be using a reference or something like that, he just kind of generalizes it and stuff like that. So I just don't think.
I like what you're pointing out there, because you're right in general. Like a PhD is a doctor of philosophy, but he is a psychologist. And I think the more important distinction that you're leading us to is this is a psychologist's take on what addiction is. This is a psychiatrist's take on what addiction is, right? This is published in the Journal of Family Therapy. Actually, this might be a psychologist too, now that I'm reading this. If it's the Journal of American Therapy, I don't know. That's not strongly predictive. But from what I understand about Kimberly Young, she is a psychiatrist, and psychologists and psychiatrists have a little bit different. Like they generally have similar ideas about addiction, but like there's, you know, one is more about chemical imbalances and one is more about like behavioral therapy, you could say. And so like that's another kind of thing that you could say, like, I would criticize, I would be right there with you saying like, I would be curious about like, is Christopher Ferguson, he's publishing in the Journal of Psychiatric Research, right? That is, I think that's strong, evidence to be, relying on there. And he's using some psychiatry as like part of his like, source strategy, right? His ethos building strategy. He's trying to build his ethos on the backs of some other researchers. But the argument that he's making isn't really based on them, as more as it's just based on his common sense understanding of these definitions, right? But I think you're absolutely right to point out in terms of like establishing himself as a trustworthy source that, what are his particular credentials? Is he overlooking something? And even I would say that, you know, neither of these authors have really talked about, there are people that study video games. Like the word isn't particularly popular, but they're called ludologists. They're mostly sociological researchers. Lud from the German ludus, or from the Latin ludus, meaning play. They study play. Like I took a course in the philosophy of sport, and the philosophy of sport leads there's almost a seamless transition from studying the philosophy of athletic sport into the philosophy of video games, because they're all aspects of play, right? You're just analyzing the philosophical importance of the idea of playfulness. What is play? Why is it important? It's a human activity and it's part of human culture, and it's been there forever, right? It's a thing that somehow makes us who we are, right? Video games seem to be an extension of this in some way, right? So I would be really interested in like what a lot of them have to say about this, or what sociology has to say about this too, instead of rather just like kind of attributing all video game use to psychological motivations that you're either embracing or running away from things, or just like bland escapism. It is fun, right? And that's one thing I like about him, is that he is admitting that there is some element of play in it, right? And that's one of the differences between gambling and video games, is that gambling isn't fun, exactly. Or its main intent is not supposed to be fun as much as its main intent is to, I mean, this kind of depends on who you ask, I guess, but you know, fun and pleasure are two different things. And the pleasure you derive from gambling, it might be fun, but it might also be because like you like thrill-seeking behaviors, right? There are a lot more different, there are a lot more concerns. Going back to what I was saying about games of chance and not really distinguishing between games of skill and games of chance. If you've ever been to a casino, if you've ever, you know that if you want to stay away from games of chance, one thing you could do is learn how to play cards. At least for poker, there's like you were saying about chess, Devin, this is where I want to bring back in the psychological element of chess. When you're playing against another opponent, even at a game of skill, there's an element of subjective like intimidation involved, right? If I'm playing someone whose ability is greater than mine, that is a factor in how, like, what the outcome's going to be. It's not always predictive, but you know, if somebody gets inside your headness about stuff, that's, you know, if you've ever watched the World Series of Poker, if you ever played poker, you realize that you're not really playing against the house, you're playing against other people, you're bluffing people, you're getting inside, like, you know, you're trying to, there's a psychological game going on at the same time. There is a game of chance going on in a certain sense. Blackjack is even less a game of chance if you know how to count cards. There's a way, that's just math, right? Like there's a way, he doesn't really talk about counting cards. He says that, you know, all casino games are, he says, unless you find out a way to cheat, casino games are games of chance. You know, if I just know how to count cards and I go into a casino and I stand at a blackjack table and I start playing blackjack and I'm counting cards only myself, how's that? I don't see that as cheating. It's not legally defined as cheating. Even if I had a group of people that were working together to count cards against a casino, that's not illegal. It's if they catch you doing it, casinos don't like it. But really, I mean, there is, I think, maybe a qualifiable difference between an individual doing it and then working together with a team to subvert the normal expectations of just playing not on a team against the house. I think there's a difference between that. If your intent is to like defraud the casino with a team of card counters, that's a little bit different than just like showing up at a truck stop casino knowing how to count a blackjack shoe. I don't think that's cheating. That's just like knowing math and like being able to like keep track of something. And it has been proven that like if you can effectively count cards, it's one of the only games in a casino that you can demonstrably increase your odds at winning against the house on. There's a lot of really interesting documentaries. There's one called Holy Rollers about a church group of card counters, really fascinating. There's one about, the most famous of which, they made a movie out of it called 21. It's about the MIT blackjack team. That, you know, if you learn how to count cards, you can beat the house. Like it's statistically in your favor. So it's not not even every casino game is a game of chance necessarily. There is a game of skill. There are games of skill in a casino. It's just not, you know, slot machines, right? So I think his argument is like sort of oversimplifying in a way about like what video games are and how all video games are and what even games of chance are in a casino and like what that even means. And we didn't really get a lot of time to dedicate to Jung's argument, mostly because I think this is just a good counterpoint to Gray's argument, because this is an argument where the definition of a video game is much broader. And this is really a lot of like describing the experience of being addicted to an experience. And I think that this offers an alternative account of maybe a persuasive definition of like what counts as a game, like what is a video game, what is the thing that is a video game. And I think I find her definition of that more persuasive. Whether or not I'm inevitably swayed by her argument, I think, I'll leave that up to you to decide for yourself. But I think that, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about logos, right? How does the chain of reasoning, like what assumptions does it rest on? How do the definitions work? What sort of inductive or deductive structures are involved with what's going on? And, I've gone over a couple of minutes here, but, we could look at, Bernie's is a little bit complicated. We could look at Walsh's. Tuition-free college programs do not increase graduation rates, therefore bachelor's programs will likely not increase graduation rates either, right? It's a pretty simple inductive argument, right? If this thing doesn't, and this analogy holds for this other thing, then we should probably not do the other thing, right? And it's kind of a similar thing, right? If that analogy fails, or if you don't think that they've sufficiently established that this is the case, then the argument falls apart, right? If the assumption isn't proved true, then it doesn't matter what the conclusion is. The conclusion doesn't follow. The daylight savings. If daylight savings possesses more benefits than drawbacks, then it should be continued. It doesn't conserve energy. It's costly. It increases health risks. Therefore, it should not be continued, right? And we talked about, this maybe being an oversimplification. This being, since they're economists, maybe the most compelling piece of evidence that they're offering, and this being complicated at best, right? So, maybe it's kind of a mixed bag. But then on the other hand, Nosowitz, he only really offers the idea that crime goes down and people think sunlight is just real neat. So that's not a particularly strong argument, I think, either, right? So at the end of the day, it really depends on, what analogies are, and, when this comes back to analogy, now we're sort of seeing the relationship between logos and pathos, because an analogy is a piece of figurative language. It's a comparison. It's saying this thing is like this thing. It's a simile. It's a metaphor. Does that metaphor hold? Does it have explanatory power? If it does, then maybe the logic works. And if it doesn't, then maybe the whole thing falls apart. Right? So we'll look at some more of these. I promise we'll get to Bernie. He's got a lot going on. But we'll get to more of that next time. We got a pair of arguments for you to read. Or I don't know why I'm referring to myself in the plural first person. But I've got a couple of arguments for you to read for next time. We'll be looking at Tremere and Lucas. We're talking about whether or not Election Day should be a federal holiday, coming on the heels of a recent federal holiday, right? So we'll talk about that next time. I'll go ahead and stop my screen share there.